Welcome to Responsible AI, the podcast for the AI Forum. Here on the podcast, we engage in critical dialogue with legal minds, tech experts, and other big thinkers on AI's legal and societal impacts, offering deep dives into public policy and best practices. Responsible AI is hosted by Alex Alben, director of the AI Forum, and me, your producer, Rebecca Staffel. You can learn more at our website, theaiforum.org. We're talking today with Nils Gilman. Nils is an historian and futurist, senior advisor to the Bear Gruen Institute in Los Angeles, and a visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. His most recent book, co-authored with Jonathan S. Blake, is Children of a Modest Star, Planetary Thinking for an Age of Crises. Nils Gilman, welcome to the show, and hello, Alex Alben.
Thank you
Nils,
for having
welcome.
me.
Great to chat with you. Thank you so much for being on the AI Forum podcast. I know you're joining us from Vienna, so this makes it a truly international affair today. We're going to jump right into it. I know that you've been thinking a lot about AI and chatbots recently. You wrote a New York Times opinion piece that had some very interesting proposals regarding liability for chatbots, both in terms of giving them certain privileges legally and also certain duties legally. And maybe you can tell us why you wrote that piece and maybe what the reaction was.
Well, this started out with me listening to some of my friends talking about how they basically were using Gemini or Claude or various other platforms as their therapist. They were working through difficulties they were having with their spouses, their children, or what have you. And, obviously when my friends tell me this, I didn't want to come down like a ton of bricks on them, but I did worry a little bit about this. So I looked up, what is the status of the privacy of the statements you make to any one of these AI chatbots? And the answer is basically you have no privacy whatsoever. There's not a presumption of privacy when you're talking to these chatbots. And that struck me as being really out of alignment with the jurisprudence around privacy when one is talking to one's therapist. And so, in the 1990s, which is not that long ago, but it's, been 30 years basically, the Supreme Court recognized that people should be able to have privacy, an expectation of privacy when they were talking to their therapists. And if my view was that if people are talking to their AI chatbots that way, they maybe should be given privilege in the same way that if they were talking to their doctor or their priest or their therapist, they would be given that kind of privilege. And so I had this kind of a functionalist argument that since people are using it this way, we need to sort of have the law catch up with the actual practices that people are engaged in with using these chatbots.
At the same time, I think you recognized in your opinion piece that there might be some sort of duty to warn somebody external from the chat if sensitive subject matter is discussed.
Right. Well, of course, there's all sorts of limits to the privacy that people have when they talk to their lawyers or they talk to their therapists. In fact, there's a duty if you're a lawyer or a therapist and you hear that a person is prepared to harm themselves or others, to actually report that to the authorities. And I do think that also ought to be a duty on the part of the AI companies. So I think that they ought to protect people when having conversations that are already recognized as privileged-like conversations, and they ought to disclose to the relevant authorities that this person is having suicidal ideation or they're planning to commit a crime or whatever it may be. So I actually think it's a both and we just need to realize that people are functionally interacting with these machines in ways that very closely mimic interhuman activities that we already have recognized new categories of legal responsibility for.
Right. And in fact, the law has been moving in this area. Just after you had your opinion piece published, California did pass a companion chatbot law that went into effect at the beginning of 2026. And it does require disclosure if someone thinks that they're acting with a human. The program has to say, no, I'm not a human. But then it has some of the safety protocols, Nils, that you just mentioned, where if there is suicidal ideation or talk about self-harm, there have to be some sort of crisis prevention warnings. There also have to be timeouts and a record needs to be kept. In addition, the new California law has additional requirements if you are dealing with a minor, which means that at least one state legislature, one state, has taken this pretty seriously and implemented some protocols around what we call companion chatbots.
Yeah, which look, I think this is good. And obviously, the AI companies are almost all based in California. So the fact that this legislation is happening here in California, I think is good. I haven't followed that closely what the reaction of the AI companies has been to this, but I would think that they might actually welcome it for several different reasons. One is, more regulation actually creates a moat for other companies not to be able to get in and compete with them. That's the cynical view. Um, the less cynical view is if you want to really drive adoption on this stuff, then you need to put into place basic guardrails and safety mechanisms that will ensure that people aren't planning to commit crimes using the AI chatbot as a co-conspirator or planning to harm themselves or saying things that they think are private when they're actually public or and that the government should not necessarily have a direct insight into everybody's private thoughts. So there's a privacy angle on this too. And all of that, if it's encumbered by law and supported by jurisprudence, I think will make people feel more confident about interacting with these things. They'll get more value individually out of it. We'll get more social value out of it. And so it actually will be good for the companies in terms of driving adoption.
Well, you ended up to be very perceptive on this chapter, which has caused a lot of controversy in the AI world and a lot of fears, justifiably, because there have been some well publicized tragic events where people did take their lives after being encouraged by chatbots to continue on a path of suicidal thoughts. And we would hope that the industry would respond even before a law needed to be passed. And in
Indeed.
fact, I think OpenAI and some of the others did say that they were instituting some guardrails. Of course, when you're dealing in the industry and trying to modify content or moderate content, the devil is always in the details as to when do you intervene? What is a suicidal ideation? When do you think someone is crossing a line between talking to a chatbot versus a human? And these are very difficult types of judgment calls to make. And so we're going to see this evolve over time.
I totally agree with all that, Alex. I guess my reaction would be that those ambiguities already exist in the confessor penitent relationship or the therapist client relationship or the doctor patient relationship. And we all, as humans, we individually struggle with that already. And the question is whether the bots are going to make worse decisions about when to throw the red flag than the humans will. If you think they're consistently going to make much worse choices about that, specifically if they're way too lenient about throwing those red flags, that's a problem, right? Or if they're way too, they can also make a second type of error where they're throwing way too many red flags and then notifying authorities every time you say, "Oh God, I felt terrible and I wanted to kill myself," and then all of a sudden there's a police coming to your door, right? I mean that would be a little insane, right? Because people can realize from tone and voice that was an obvious hyperbole. Whereas when you're doing a chatbot, it's much harder to tell those kinds of things. So I think that, the technology is going to have to adopt to all of that. But I don't think this is a new problem, actually. I think this problem already exists in the human to human relationship.
We're speaking with Nils Gilman, who is a futurist and a historian. I want to continue maybe on the theme of virtual reality, if that's where we are. I remember about 20 years ago, there was a virtual world created called Second Life, and it actually did very well and had millions of adherents. But as soon as people were able to create their own avatars to play in this virtual environment, crime started to happen as well. And I remember that there was a case in Japan where a woman discovered that a man's avatar was having an affair with another woman's avatar, and therefore she stole the husband's password, gained access to his avatar, and ended up killing the woman's avatar who was having the affair with him. The question then under Japanese law was whether this was a crime because there was the resulting death of an avatar. I know this is sort of out of left field, but have you been thinking about how AI is sort of blending the boundaries between virtual reality and real reality?
Yeah, I don't know that particular case, but just from the way you've described it, Alex, to me, that's not a murder, but it might be a tort, right? It might be creating some kind of a mental harm.
The suit was for intentional infliction of emotional distress.
Right.
Yeah.
So, that seems to me like I would, definitely think that that could be something we talk about. I mean, I'm actually surprised that there aren't more suits like that regarding all of people's, personal interactions, whether they're, pile-ons on social media or terrible behavior on dating apps or a variety of other ways in which people behave in awful ways online. And you would think that people might sue more, but the fact is most of it is just the vast, vast majority of the terrible behavior that people engage in, which does inflict mental harm on, counterparties, is basically we just treat it as like that's part of our new reality, and we haven't created norms against that.
You've thought a lot about governance in your writing and public speaking. Who should govern the internet and AI? Should it be the U.S. Congress? Should it be some European setup? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is a really interesting question. And to me, this is a subset of a much larger question, which is who should govern technology and specifically technology risks more broadly. And I don't have a clear answer on it, to be completely honest with you. And I think it varies a little bit on a case by case basis. What I will say is there's a paradox, right? Because if you only have it governed by the jurisdiction where the companies are based, despite the fact that they are global companies or they're operating way outside of the jurisdiction where they're based, then you end up with a situation where you may have regulatory capture in various ways. On the other hand, if you only have it governed from afar, right? So if the Europeans want to be the capital of AI governance, despite the fact that no AI companies are based there, that creates a different kind of problem where the AI companies are like, this is just a trade sanction happening by moralizing means. So I think there's a tension between those two things that I don't know that there's a current jurisdictional model for. What I will say is that some international institutions have been built, or transnational institutions is maybe the better word, for dealing with not the kinds of things we've been talking about so far, but you think about the way ICON was set up to manage, you know, internet domain names in the late 1990s on a transnational global basis. Now, obviously, that was a much less emotionally charged and a much less economically high stakes situation, but that did create a body of people who were from around the world and were technologically informed who could make collective decisions around these things. And I realize that this kind of a globalist model, as people might critically say about it today, is way out of fashion these days. But I do think that some model like that probably makes sense. Absent that, though, I would just say that it's very likely that we're going to end up in a balkanized world where there are totally different stacks and regulatory models in different parts of the world. And to me, that's a pretty bad outcome because we end up, instead of with one global internet that was open the way we all dreamed about in the 1990s, with much more siloed internets, which would be not a great outcome.
Nils, you've written about this, not necessarily in the context of AI, but a recent book that you co-authored is Children of a Modest Star. And you talk about different governance models, including one that I don't understand at all. It's called Planetary Subsidiarity. Does that have any application maybe to tech governance?
Maybe.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try to keep this as short as possible. So there's two words in there, planetary and subsidiarity, right? And each of them is a little bit complicated, but let me try to unpack them as quickly as possible. So planetary refers to the flows of things around the world that are perhaps perturbed by humans, but are not controlled by humans or intentionally um, managed by humans. Humans manage things like money and goods and migration and stuff like that. That's about human intention. But then there's all this other stuff that happens that flows around the world, like the carbon molecules in the atmosphere or the oceanic plastics or the space junk in the atmosphere.
The
Humans
ozone
are
layer. Yeah.
the ozone layer, right? These are all things that humans are affecting, but not because we intended to do that, just because it's happening. And crucially, these are things that transcend any given border, right? And they inherently transcend any given border, right? The ozone layer, the space junk, the oceanic plastics, no one country can govern that by definition because it's flowing everywhere, right? And so therefore you need a different kind of governance model for dealing with those kinds of things. The current national sovereignty based governance model simply is not capable of addressing those kinds of things. So that's the category of planetary challenges. And so just to talk about the AI issue, I'm not sure tech falls into that for reasons I'll get into in a second. Then there's the subsidiarity model. And this is an old idea that goes back to actually the 1500s in Europe. And that says that the decision-making authority for any given political issue should be allocated to the smallest geographic unit that's functionally capable of dealing with that, right? So you want decisions made, ideally, decisions will be more democratic if they're made closer to the people who are affected by them. So if it's a local issue, you want the local community to deal with it. If it's a larger issue that like ramifies out to the city or the region or the state, then you may want to allocate those decisions higher up. And then there are some issues like these planetary ones that we talk about that really cannot be dealt with even at a national level. They have to be dealt with at a planetary level. And otherwise, they're just not going to work. The US or China, the two most powerful countries in the world, can't solve the climate change problem, can't solve the oceanic plastics problem by themselves. They have to figure out a way to do this with other countries. Okay, so where does AI fit into that, or tech risk in general fit into that? It is possible to imagine, but I think it's a bad scenario that we would end up with these tech silos. So there's a China stack, and there's a US stack, and there's a Europe stack, and maybe there's a Russian and India stack too, where they have their own governance models, their own technologies. And you could imagine separating these things out in a way you can't with things like carbon or space junk, right? So in theory, technologically, you could have separate stacks, separate hemispheric stacks. But I think that that's a bad outcome, right? Just because we would like our stacks to be able to interact with other stacks. And if we have totally different regulatory models, that's going to become more and more difficult, and we'll end up with a siloed planet. That's a values issue for me personally. I mean, I like the fact that I can go to Vienna and I can go to Los Angeles and I can travel back and forth between the two, and I don't have to get totally different devices, totally different AI systems, and so on. That's me. That's my personal value. Some people might say that's a better outcome. We should have we should just have different regulatory models for different jurisdictions. We should have different technologies for different jurisdictions. I don't think the AI companies would like that. I don't think
Now,
Apple would like that. And that's one reason I don't think we're going to get to that point, right? I think that like the big companies, which have their own power, are going to push back.
Nils Gilman, who is affiliated with the Berggruen Institute, we're talking about some of your recent books, and on this theme of governance, I think that people, whether it's in the tech industry or outside of the tech industry, governance is a growing important topic. We have some more awareness of it than we used to. I was just reading about the proposal, the committee, the so-called peace board that's supposed to be running Gaza. And you would think, well, okay, that's probably a very good idea that there is both local control to talk about subsidiarity, but also non political control, technocrats that can manage the immediate human needs of these people who just need food and water and shelter and take the politics out of it. So, as a futurist, are you optimistic at all that we still have the capacity to do these local governance projects that benefit people?
I think there's a couple of different questions. There's several different questions there. I mean, Gaza is a particularly
There's at least
thorny.
5 questions in there.
Yeah. I mean, I feel embarrassed saying this to a law professor, but the cliche is that hard cases make bad law. And Gaza is the ultimate hard case. And so I'm not sure I would want to generalize from what people are attempting there.
Fair enough. Fair
Right.
enough.
With that said, I mean, look, I think that there right now is a swing against the idea of technocrats, at least in their governmental form. Right. And, you look at the history of bureaucracy, bureaucratic government over the last, 150 years, there's swings back and forth between more eras that are more sympathetic to highly competent bureaucrats being in charge of things and ones where there's a skepticism that these people are basically captured by elites or are corrupt in their own right. And, there's a variety of versions of that critique. They don't know enough. They're not skilled enough. They're corrupt. I mean, there's a variety of ways of critiquing the technocratic option. We're currently in a moment that's obviously very skeptical of bureaucratic competence and technocratic competence for many good reasons. With that said, every major advance in human capacity, whether it's happened through governmental bureaucracies or through corporate bureaucracies or through other kinds of human coordination mechanisms, has involved doing things and generating skill sets that were unprecedented. And to just assume that it's not possible to do that again seems to me a kind of pessimism about human capacity that I don't personally subscribe to.
Well, so on this optimism-pessimism divide, this echoes some themes of a book that you wrote called Mandarins of the Future, where you looked at how people during the Cold War era were imagining modern society. And they were very optimistic in some ways, but it kind of didn't turn out that way necessarily. So I guess should we be optimistic given the history of, I don't know, futurism, our ideas of what the future can be? Because there's certainly a strain in our society these days of pretty bleak apocalyptic scenarios. And this gets reflected in television and books and other places. So what's your perspective on this divide?
On the optimism-pessimism divide? Yeah, it's funny. That book, Manners of the Future, was started as my dissertation back in the 1990s. And
Oh, really? When you were at Cal or?
yeah, I was at
Yeah.
Berkeley.
Yeah.
And started as a dissertation, and the idea for it actually started when I was an undergraduate in the early 1990s, right at the end of the Cold War. And I published the book in 2003. And I didn't have any idea that I would one day evolve into becoming somebody who is called a futurist at the time, although the word future is right there in the title, ironically. And the people I was writing about, I didn't really think of them as being futurists, actually, although they were that. They were making anticipations about how can you modernize societies that are emerging from colonialism, right? Like how do you help a country that's poor, that just is coming out of the colonial yoke, become a modern democratic society, capitalist society. I mean, that was what they were trying to do during the Cold War. And they had all these technocratic ideas because it was the middle of the 20th century about how to do that. And a lot of those ideas turned out to be really bad. And some of them led us into some of the worst catastrophes, strategic catastrophes as a country we've ever gotten into. I mean, these ideas were at the core of some of the justifications for the Vietnam War, which I still think is, even now, is the worst catastrophe that the United States has engaged in since the end of the Second World War. How optimistic am I about this? Oh, look, I think that when I started out doing futures work in the mid-aughts, there was a lot of optimism about American society. This was before the financial crisis. I mean, things were already bad in Iraq by the time I started getting into that, but there was still this idea that America could do things. And, Obama was elected and reelected on a message of hope and optimism, right? And that really has turned in the last decade. And there's now like a deeply pessimistic view of the future of America, the future of the world. And being a little bit of a contrarian, back in the Bush and Obama years, I tended to be very pessimistic and telling a lot of scary stories when I would do my futures work about climate change and about, the rise of a red China and the fact that there was going to be a social media platform controlled by other countries. And maybe we should have a plan for that, right? These were all things I was saying 15 years ago that people didn't listen to me then about because I was a contrarian, and that's what happens when you're a contrarian. And now in the last 10 years, I've actually tried to take the opposite view as we've gone to a very dark and pessimistic place ever since, Trump's first inaugural, or the American Carnage inaugural, which George Bush himself described as some weird shit, quote unquote. Since then, I've tried to take a more optimistic view and say, where are the spaces for hope in these dark times? And so I've tended to say, when people assume things are always going to get worse in the last 10 years, now they have been getting worse and worse, right? And I've also been involved in saying we really need to anticipate the bad possible outcomes. But I've also tried to do on the normative side, in terms of trying to create a vision of what we could do instead, to be a little bit more positive.
That's really an interesting perspective in terms of people will always say the worst is yet to come versus what Voltaire's character, right, Dr. Pangloss said, this is the best of all possible worlds. The truth invariably is between those two poles. I would say with respect to AI, there is a lot of doom saying in terms of where AI is leading. I encounter this when I go to conferences. I encounter this with my students. There's a lot of fear associated with the ultimate iteration of AI. What are your thoughts on that? Should we be fearful, or essentially is this a technology that's going to be like other technologies and have both good and bad aspects?
Yeah. So this particular question, and in general, technological futures, is one that I definitely address and think about in historical terms. I mean, I studied the history of technology a lot in college and graduate school, and the rise of general purpose technologies. Things like steam engines and printing presses and stuff like this, right? That not only create industries in themselves, but transform the entire society and all the industries around them because of what they do. And AI is for sure such a technology, right? I mean, this is why OpenAI calls their platform, Chat GPT, Chat General Purpose Technology. It's a pun. And so my view of this is there's a lot of inflationary rhetoric on both the doomer side and the cornucopian side, that this is going to create a world where there's no more work. And some people say that's great, nobody has to work. And some people say, oh my God, I'm never going to have a job. And sometimes it gets existential. It's going to it's going to allow us to escape the limits of the solar system and travel to other places and allow humans to propagate across the universe. And so other people will be like, no, it's going to create existential, it's going to kill us all, right? So people can inflate either one of the positive or negatives for, to a great extent. And I actually have a deflationary attitude towards both of those narratives, which is that this is a really important technology. In my lifetime, I've seen 3 breakthrough technologies that were like game changers. When I held them in my hand, I said, oh, that's it. The first one was the internet, specifically the general purpose browser from Netscape. The second one was the iPhone, when you had the internet in your pocket. And the third one is ChatGPT and AI platforms in general. This is like a major, major big deal. So I'm not trying to deflate it from that perspective. With that said, everything in the universe, and here I want to cite somebody, Vaclav Smil, who's a wonderful Canadian academic. He wrote a book called Growth. And what he accounts in that book is that every single thing in the universe, bacteria, stars, human cities, grow on an S curve. So they start out with exponential growth, and then eventually they start flattening out because nothing grows forever in a finite universe, right? So
Right.
the star might become super huge, right? If it's the one at the center of the galaxy, or it might become just a yellow dwarf like the one we are rotating around. But the point is, it's not going to grow forever. Even the one at the center of our galaxy S-curved out at a certain point. It stopped growing and reached a certain stable size. The bacteria in the petri dish will grow for a while. And technology is like that too. The technology adoption curve, the technology impact curve, there's usually a phase of extreme exponential growth, adoption, and impact. And at that moment for general purpose technologies, people, whether they are boomers or doomers, think that this is going to be radically transformational. And then eventually it flattens out and it has a huge impact. I mean, like obviously the printing press had an enormous impact on human history. Agriculture had an enormous impact on human history. So I don't mean to diminish it at that level. I don't personally think AI is probably a technology at quite the level of either of those, but it might be at the level of electricity, which was a hugely impactful technology. And a lot of people had doomer and boomer expectations about electricity too.
Correct. And the thing is, I think that what we aim for in this podcast and our other endeavors is to have people have a better understanding of actually what the promises, the real promises are of the technology, and what the real failures could be. Have you thought about that? What do you think the real promises are of AI? How do you use AI in your work to improve your work? Let's say.
Well, I'm probably a very low grade user of AI, to be totally honest. I mean, I use it as a basic research assistant. I use it to solve a blank page problem often, particularly when I'm writing my Substacks. It's a first draft for me. I don't use it for compositional purposes in the sense of style, working as a writer for almost 40 years at this point. So I have my own way of writing, and I've trained the 2 bots that I use on my entire corpus. And so they are actually closer to what I already do. I do worry that for younger people who haven't learned how to do the things that I learned how to do in an analog pre-AI world, they won't have the fundamental baseline of training to do I mean, I know what a good text looks like because I've been editing people and writing things myself for a very long time. And so I know what these things look like. And I know when ChatGPT is spitting out garbage. But I think if you're 20 and you've lived your whole life in college in the wake of ChatGPT, you might not have already been trained up in that. And so I do worry that there's going to be a kind of loss of capacity in a younger and emerging generation. With that said, I've got kids who are 20, 22, and 18, and they seem more competent than I was at their age. Now, with that said, that's my personal use. That's the second part of your question. But the first part of your question is, how do I think it's going to be transformational? I think there's a lot of knowledge worker jobs that are very rote, that are going to be highly automatable. So a lot of accounting work, for example, I think is going to be, and a lot of legal discovery work, and a lot of initial medical intake work and things like this, which currently employ a lot of people who make decent livings doing that. A lot of that stuff is going to go away. I can tell you a personal story. One of the fun things about when you get to your mid-50s is how many jobs have you had have now been automated away? I've had
Yeah.
several that like don't exist already.
Such as,
Well, I'll give you two. The first one was my very first job when I was 16 years old was working at McDonald's and taking orders. That job doesn't exist anymore. Like now there's machines that do that. And by the way, that was a shit job. I mean, I got paid $3.35 an hour in 1985 to work that job, and it sucked. Like I'm not regretting that that job doesn't exist anymore. The second job I had was actually working as a paralegal after college, and I was working on a case where I had to analyze literally 10,000 files from our client and create a narrative about what had happened in this particular case. And it took me 8 months to read through all the files, organize them, figure out what the narrative was, coordinate with the lawyers to figure out if that was the right stuff. Now you could just feed all those documents into the machine and it could be done in hours.
in minutes, in
In
minutes.
minutes, maybe.
It
Right.
is
In
just
minutes.
scary. And just to shift gears, you used a very interesting phrase to describe some of the leaders in AI and technology today. You called them organic intellectuals, people like Mark Andreessen and Elon Musk. What does it mean to be an organic intellectuals? Usually we associate the word organic with good, healthy things, but I'm not sure that's your meaning here.
So the term organic intellectual is from the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, who was writing in the 1920s and 1930s. He was imprisoned by Mussolini, and he didn't die in prison. He was let out a couple weeks before he was on death's door when he was let out of prison. And he wrote a series of famous, now famous texts known as the prison notebooks. In one of these notebooks, he develops this idea of the organic intellectual. His argument is that there are intellectuals, and by the way, the term intellectual was quite new in the 1920s and 30s, in the early 1930s when he was writing about this. The term intellectual only was invented in the 1890s. But, traditional intellectuals are people who are highly educated in, you know, at universities, and they are men and women of letters, and they are sophisticates and cosmopolitans and so on. So those are traditional intellectuals. What Gramsci meant by organic intellectuals, and he did mean it as a compliment because he was thinking about working class intellectuals. He was thinking about people who are members of trade unions and who become intellectuals on the basis of their professional life experience, not because they've studied stuff, but because of what they've learned in their lived experience. And that idea, and initially it's a Marxist idea, and he's talking about valorizing the people who are thinking about things because they're working on the factory floor, they're working on the shop floor, they are working on figuring out how to organize a labor union, and they're not theorizing stuff abstractly at a university. They're living it and understanding, and they are putting ideas into practice and therefore learning what works and what doesn't, and they're constantly honing their belief system based on what they experience and learn on the job. Okay. So that's the original Marxist idea. This has been expanded since Gramsci was writing this stuff almost a century ago to apply to other categories of people. So you can talk about the organic intellectuals of the defense establishment, right? So people at the Rand Corporation and intellectuals who are smart people who are theorizing things in the Pentagon, right? Or in the CIA, right? These are people who they're theorizing things, but they're also putting it into practice and seeing what works and changing their theories about the world based partly on their thinking, but partly on what they're actually experiencing works. So anyways, that's the kind of basic idea of an organic intellectual. And I've suggested that there's this new emergent class of people in the Silicon Valley who are that kind of person. They are theorizing what technology is about, partly based on the fact that they are thinking about it, but they're also looking at what actually works in practice when they are venture capitalists and programmers and so on. Now, the people who are in those positions in Silicon Valley today tend to be precisely the venture capitalists, the people who have made it really rich, because these are the people who are not like slogging to make their first bank. They've now made their first bank. They've made their billion or their 100 million or what have you. And now they think like people who have $100 million, and they think they are representing the true nature of technology, where in fact, they are representing the nature of the winners of the capitalist class of the current generation of technology. So when I talk about this organic intellectuals of the Silicon Valley, what I'm talking about is the kind of people who have emerged as the intellectual spokespeople and they're all, by the way, spokesmen, not a coincidence, the spokesmen for a certain kind of ideology about what technology is supposed to do, how it should be regulated, how it should, be allowed to change our society.
I want to pick up on that, just the one of the last things you said about how it should be regulated, because I think you described them as an anti-regulatory fortress. And yet I thought it was brilliant when Sam Altman and some of the others were called before Congress a year or two ago about AI. And they all said, we would love regulation. Please regulate us, Congress. And it caught congressmen by surprise. And then, of course, they said, oh, well, we'll study it. So is it an anti-regulatory fortress, or is technology, as I like to tell my class, just moving so quickly that you really can't effectively regulate it?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on there. First of all, there's a cynical view that I referred to earlier. They would like regulations. The big AI companies would like there to be regulations come in that basically create barriers to entry for any new entrants. And so, because if there's a regulatory burden that they can afford right now, but that it's going to exclude new startups, that's already a good thing for them. So again, there's a little bit of a motive around that. There's also, I think, I don't know Altman personally, but he's a disarming and charming presence, and he may have been, being a little bit performative for the senators and congressmen that he
I
was
think he was
testifying in front of.
entirely performative. Yeah.
But there's another aspect of this, which is that, and goes to the performative thing, which is say, we totally welcome regulation in principle, but every particular regulation we reject. Or because we would essentially like to self-regulate. And we'll do a little consortium, like Anthropic and Google and OpenAI will get together and create an industry compact around X, Y, and Z. We don't need you 80-year-old senators to tell us what to do. And this is something which I'm a little bit sympathetic to them about. I mean, when you see the quality of the questions that are coming out of Congress around what's going on with social media or AI or what have you, I mean, it's a really pretty. You wouldn't want those people regulating. I'm not a shill for the industry, but I don't feel confident that getting John Kennedy from Louisiana regulating my AI is going to be a step up from having Sam Altman make his own ethical choices.
Just moving on to the last few minutes that we have, tickled to speak with someone who is a futurist. So, do you get asked very frequently as a futurist, please predict the future for us? Or how do you deal with that label in your career?
To be totally honest, I haven't loved it, partly because the futurist industry is, bluntly put, filled with charlatans. And I say that because actually we have no evidence about the future, right? If you're at all an empiricist, we have no evidence. We can do various ways of thinking about the future that I think some of which are more rigorous than others. We can extrapolate, we can try to imagine scenarios in various creative ways. We can look at historical records of similar episodes. I mean, there's a variety of methods for thinking about this. And I actually am a firm believer that there are better and worse ways to think about the future. I'm working on a book on that topic exactly right now. But I don't love the label because a lot of people crowd into the space and say, I'm a futurist and I'm going to tell you about the 9 things about AI that are going to change your sex life, right? Or whatever. And I don't love that kind of way.
I'm gonna need to change the title of my book then. Okay.
Okay. So I don't love that style of futurism, the sort of listicle clickbait, like, here's 9 ideas I have about how the way things are going to change. What I will say is that my personal way to think about the future is to think about it in the same kind of structural way that I think about history. So for me, it's about turning the telescope around from the past to the future. So when I think about historical episodes, like why did the First World War happen? Why did the Second World War happen? You think about many different causal factors that played into that: political, economic, environmental, social, technological, military. And you want to have a complex understanding of the factors that led into this really epical event. And so when I try to think about what might happen in the future, I try to think about the confluence of different macro causal factors that are going to potentially impact a particular question, with the acknowledgement that we can't see which of those many variables is going to turn out to be the most important one. So yeah, I get asked all the time, what do you think's going to happen with Trump? And I say, I
Yeah.
don't know. Like, he could drop dead tomorrow. Maybe he's going to try to stay in power forever. Maybe the longevity cures from Larry Ellison are going to work on him. I'm pretty skeptical of that last scenario, but who knows?
Well, I think what you were saying is consistent with one of my favorite quotes, which I just pulled up by Ray Bradbury, and I was lucky enough to know Ray as a kid growing up. He was a friend of the family.
Cool.
This is one of his quotes about the future. He said, "People ask me to predict the future when all I want to do is prevent it. Better yet, build it. Predicting the future is much too easy anyway. You look at the people around you, the street you stand on, the visible air you breathe, and predict more of the same. To hell with more. I want better." That's a quote by Ray Bradbury, author of Fahrenheit 451, The Martian Chronicles, The Illustrated Man, etc. Do you agree with Ray Bradbury?
I agree. We have to create the future. With that said, I guess I have two comments about this. One is that visions of the future help create the future. And from that, actually, this is a book that somebody needs to write. Somebody needs to write a book about the way in which science fiction has fundamentally informed the way that technology producers, technologists, try to create products. I know a lot of senior people in Silicon Valley have said, I became a technologist because I read science fiction X or Y, and I wanted to create whatever the next technology was. And so the inspirational quality for science fiction to actual technologists is incredibly important. So there's a kind of a dialectical relationship, I think, between the Imagineers, the visionaries of the future, on the one hand, and the builders and the technologists and the engineers on the other. And there's been forever a kind of a dialogue between them that I think is really important to sustain. You know, one of the things I think that has gone really off the rails in the last 10 years is as we've moved towards a totally dystopian dominated science fiction sphere, like there's been a divorce, and now you have the technologists who are not tethered in by a continuous dialogue with humanistic creativity and are just like flying off on their own crazy fantasies of building the network state or, you know, escaping human constraint by colonizing Greenland or Mars or Antarctica or whatever the current theory is. And I think this has been a real loss. Now, this goes back to the old two cultures debate from the 1950s of like the scientists and the humanists not talking to each other. I think, I've spent my entire career trying to get the scientists and the humanists to talk to each other more. And it's been rather frustrating to see that all come apart.
I love ending on the note of C.P. Snow, the two cultures, and his call for reconciliation between a humanistic vision and a scientific vision. I also love your quote, Nils, visions of the future help create the future. Thank you so much for being on the AI Forum, Responsible AI podcast.
My pleasure and my honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Nils Gilman, for joining us on the Responsible AI podcast from the AI Forum. You can subscribe to the Responsible AI podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, or wherever you like to listen. See what we've been reading about the legal and ethical implications of AI on our website, theaiforum.org.